everybody, and welcome back to Eggs the Podcast. But before we get started, I want to talk to you about our sponsor, Tailor Style. Most guys actually do want to dress better. They want to look sharper, more put together, more confident, better in business, meetings, date nights, conferences, traveling, wherever life is happening. The problem is most men eventually abandon it because they don't want to think about it. They don't want to shop, they don't want to coordinate outfits, they don't want to spend Saturday wandering through the mall trying to figure out what smart casual means anymore. So what's the easiest way to dress better? Tailor Style. Tailor is an AI-powered menswear styling and rental service backed up by real human stylists. You fill out a quick profile, AI learns your fit and style preferences, and then an actual stylist fine-tunes the looks and ships complete outfits right to your door. And honestly, that's the magic of it. You still get to look like the guy who has his act together without spending the mental energy of getting there. I'm a subscriber right now, and every few weeks I get a box with hand-picked outfits chosen by a real stylist, refined by their AI, and the crazy part is they actually nail it most of the time. Stuff I would never go buy, but I end up wearing nonstop just because it works. You wear the clothes, send them back when you're done, and the next box shows up. Easy. No laundry, no shopping, no overthinking it. It's just one less thing pulling on your attention every week, and somehow you end up looking better for it. Go to tailor.style, that's TAELOR.style, and use promo code EGGS to take 25% off your first month. Once again, that's TAELOR.style. Use promo code EGGS to take 25% off your first month. They handle the clothes so you can focus on everything else. And now, back to the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Eggs the Podcast. Today's special guest is Tyler Wells. Tyler, how are you, man? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Me too. Thanks so much for making the time. Let's start, I guess, kind of just at the top and talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why we're talking today.
Sure. So I'm Tyler Wells. I'm the co-founder and CTO of BrainGrid.ai. Been in this industry for, you can tell by the gray hair, for probably north of 25 years. I've worked in a whole bunch of different companies from small to relatively large. Spent a bunch of time at places like Skype and Twilio, and it's now the third company that I've started. And we are kind of focused squarely in the world of AI right now.
Oh, I love that so much. Well, let's talk a little bit just in the beginning to kind of lay some groundwork about sort of your entrepreneurialism. You said this is your third startup.
Yep.
So obviously a lot of people who listen to this show go through those things. Can you talk at all about just sort of, I guess, maybe if you want to focus on this project or if you want to talk about other things in the past, but what was sort of your first foray into entrepreneurship? Like what took you there from working at like a Skype or a Twilio?
No, I think it's always just been a dream that I've had and something that I've wanted to do. I've always wanted to run my own company. I watched my father, grandfather, and uncles all run their own company, and I've seen others do it, and decided to take the crazy jump a number of years ago and say, like, let's just go for it, and had an idea and let's try it and see what happens. The first one was definitely a big learning experience, and that was kind of in between my time at Skype and Twilio. Obviously didn't go as planned, and that's fine. But from all failures, you can learn a ton of things, and I definitely did. And then I kind of spent the next 7.5 years at Twilio, which at that point in time was under 200 people, and when I left, it was probably over 5,000. So I got to see a different stage of growth and sort of explosion of what that looks like, going from sub 200, employees to over 5,000, sub 100 million revenue to, what it is today. And then took all that experience and joined up with another ex-colleague at Twilio and said, let's do this again. Let's jump back on this train and try to build something. And, for me, it's always been, I like the idea of doing hard things. I like the idea of being challenged. I think starting a company from zero, trying to get it to one is sort of that ultimate challenge out there. How do you take something that you see as a problem in the world, or you see as a something that you want to build, and how do you turn that into something that can help more than just yourself, and put it out there and see what happens.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and one of the things you talked about is sort of this like iterative growth, right? You started out with your first project, it went as far as it went or whatever, and then it fizzled. And then you moved back to regular employment or regular W-2 style employment. Then you jumped back out again, took another shot at it. And I imagine that second round went a little further, maybe a little faster because you had a little wind in your sails. Maybe you had a good founder or co-founder with you. Can you talk about the transition from that company to now what you're doing? and how that sort of transition happened. And the one thing that I'm really trying to understand here, and we've seen this with a lot of guests and a lot of people who are going through the entrepreneurial sphere, there's this moment in a founder's life, this thing that we call the lid. And the notion is that you run into this kind of invisible barrier between what you know how to do and what you don't know how to do. And there's sort of a, act that you have to go through to transition this, whatever we want to call it, this invisible barrier, this energy or whatever that
Yep.
keeps you from moving on to the next thing. For some people, it can be, through the help of a mentor or something who can like hold your hand and drag you through the lid. For other folks, it might be more like, you pick up the piece of knowledge in a prior failed attempt and then you move forward. And this time you can go further faster, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So I wondered if you just talk about, that transition going from guy who knows nothing, and I'm assuming knows nothing in version one, then version two, whatever that was, and now to version three of entrepreneurship, what that looks like, and just sort of
Yeah, I
maybe
mean,
talk about failure on the road too.
yeah, I mean, I think every time, you come in with a little more experience. I think you said it right. I mean, there's a whole ton of things that you don't know, but you just got to figure it out, right? When there's only two of you as co-founders, there's not a whole lot of there's not a team of people that you can lean upon because obviously you can't hire them, you don't have the type of funds, and really it's up to you to figure all of those things out. And when we left Twilio to start the next company, which is called Propel, we had an idea that we felt that had been more or less battle tested within Twilio. My team and I built the platform that we sort of pulled out of there from an idea perspective and said, hey, look, this is applicable to not just Twilio. We kept seeing it across a whole number of other customers inside of Twilio. Like, hey, how do we get a platform like this? And how do we do this thing that you guys do with the analytics and everything else like that? So we'd extracted it out of there with this idea of like, look, we can build this because this has such a high degree of applicability across not just a single vertical like Twilio, but all companies need analytics and they need it in a certain way. Excuse me. And so we went out there with the idea of like, focusing heavily on the technology, focusing on building the platform. But then where, we started bumping up against things that we didn't necessarily know how to do well, which was that whole go-to-market motion of, how to take this platform that can do all these things and sort of spread that gospel across, all the industry and turn them into believers. And, we had to bring in, marketing folks that were sort of specialists in this. We had to augment every time there were things that we couldn't necessarily do. We started bumping up against, our knowledge. It was, where can we reach out to kind of find the best people in the industry to come in and try to help us, and what can we actually afford? And so, every single time, like there was just going to be things that, when you're a W-2 employee and you're kind of, a non-founder, like all that structure is already in place. So many things just exist for you, that you kind of, more or less take for granted. Like, how do I do billing? How do I do my marketing? How do I, set up channel sales? How do all of that? I never had to think about that from the engineering side. That was just already done. But then you go start your own company. I mean, you've got to do it. There's not really you can beg, borrow playbooks out there and try them, but at the end of the day, you've got to find something that works, and it's up to you to figure it out.
Yeah,
And
no,
with
I
that
love
one,
that.
and I was going to say with that one, I can't say that the lid was ever removed. We bumped up. We ended up getting towards the end of 2024, and right around that same time is when you started seeing things like Cursor and AI really start to explode on the market. And I think that sort of shut the lid on just so many things across the board, because then everything became like, well, aren't we just going to be able to solve this with AI? Isn't AI just going to do this? And I think it stalled out, a lot of the deals that we were in discussions with. A lot of our go-to-market, everything was sort of met with, well, AI is going to solve this eventually for me. So I'm just going to wait and see what happens. And, ultimately we ended up shutting the company down and then pivoting into BrainGrid.
Yeah. No, I love that. And actually that little moment that you added there, I'm sorry I interrupted you. That little moment that you described there is actually a great segue into what you're doing now. I mean, for work, obviously, but also I think just sort of in the, I don't know, you could call it a broader tech industry, but you're starting to see this everywhere, which is companies are starting to lay off. I assume some of this is headcount that they probably had too much of anyway, and now they're just blaming AI.
Yeah.
But you're definitely seeing people say AI is the reason we're getting rid of people, things like that. And I'm familiar enough with what's going on in AI right now that I'm going, well, I don't think you're really replacing those people with AI yet. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe one day, but I don't think we're there yet. And I guess maybe it depends on the role. But I think it's really interesting that you started butting up against some of that stuff too, which is just people making the excuse that, oh, I don't need to invest in this because AI is going to solve it.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if we can help maybe level set for the rest of this conversation. But I mean, clearly you took that as I don't know, like a jolt to go get started digging deep on AI, I assume. Obviously, you probably had been using it before, but I mean, this was maybe a reason to start digging in on what can AI do, what can't AI do, and where
Yeah.
are the gaps.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so,
I'm sorry.
just to just finish that thought. So the I guess what I'd like to try and do is like level set, like what should be the expectations? Where are we actually in AI world? And then we can talk about the rest.
Yeah. And I mean, it's changed a lot from obviously the end of 2024 to now. I mean, it's like insane amount of change. Where we had to start using it was because we had to do our own sort of headcount reduction as we saw Propel not making the numbers we needed to make it a sustainable business. We obviously having to start cut headcount, and but we still had to ship product. Both myself and my co-founder were like, we're not done. We still think this has a chance. So we'll have to, cut our burn rate and sort of double down. But that meant that, we have to start picking up a lot of the implementation and building. And so in order for us to continue to scale and build, we kind of doubled down into things like Cursor because that was kind of the main IDE and the main sort of entry point into, coding with AI at the time. Like there wasn't even really agentic coding yet. And so, we doubled down on that and started just really learning a ton about, okay, how do we make these things actually write production level code? And it was through our own trial and error and research and just constantly butting our heads up against it that, we kind of figured out this process. We sort of figured out how important context was. We started to, put all of these pieces together and then just realized like, okay, Propel's not going to make it, but we feel like there's something here. Let's go start, BrainGrid. And so as we started building BrainGrid, obviously we're building all of that with AI and we kind of dove headfirst into, how do we get these agents to build everything for us? And, what is the state of their output and can we actually trust it? And I would say like, most of 25 was a lot of trust and verify. You obviously you've got AI writing all of this code for you, um, producing a huge amount of output, but all of that still has to be tested. And so a lot of the same processes that we would have to do that we put in place for managing human output are the same types of things that we put in to manage the output from AI, like the validation, the testing, the user acceptance, everything like that. And then as we would learn more and more, we would start to fold that in. And I would say the big shift came towards, the end of 25 into 26 when we started seeing, like the, Opus 4.7 models start to show up. And I would say that was like a huge, improvement in terms of the output you now started getting from these agents. Whereas, we could essentially, one shot, product creation and everything else like that. And the output we were getting was very good. In terms of layoffs and everything else like that, I agree with you. I think there was organizations swelled tremendously with employees, especially during COVID, post COVID and things of that nature. And, they had to take a step back and look at the bottom line of like, look, we're not in, the zero interest rate world anymore. The world is changing. AI is changing everything. It's a pretty viable excuse to say like, oh, you were just going to use AI to kind of, trim the head count and everybody's going to kind of believe that because there's so much hype around there about AI replacing jobs. Is it replacing some? Yeah. But is it replacing all? Is it making developers obsolete? I think absolutely not. It's not there yet. Is that day going to come? Possibly, but I don't think it's going to, the nature of what being a software developer is, I think is changing more and evolving into this place of, sort of like stewardship of the agents and getting the agents to do what it is you need them to do and do it correctly.
Yeah, no, there's a couple things in there I want to try and break down. One of them I wanted to talk about initially is you talked about some of the framework that you guys are using in terms of, or had been using in terms of sort of establishing guardrails and things like that
Yeah.
for your systems, where you're doing, you guys have, or the system has generated code, but now it's going through a review and it's doing some of these other steps, things that you would do with a normal software team.
Yep.
What do you think the difference is, or is there any difference in sort of thinking like an AI versus thinking like a human? And so, and the question is that AI was built by humans, and so theoretically, things that work on humans feel like the things that should work on AI. Like we should be able to talk to it sort of in a human way, tell it to run these audits and do the kinds of things, like we would a human engineer. But is there a difference, or is AI somehow different in its software development modes, where you actually need to talk to it using different language or a different way of thinking altogether versus just like this is another human engineer? Does that make sense? It's kind of a
Yeah, it
nuanced
does. I
question,
mean,
but do you see what I'm saying?
yeah, I don't think you can treat it just like another human. And I think where I see that is if you say to another human, like, hey, you need to test A, B, C, and D, and you tell the AI that it's going to test exactly A, B, C, and D. If you give that to a human and they're going through and testing A and B, and suddenly they hit something during B, they may not move on to C. They may think like, "Hey, I actually need another step after B." Like there's sort of this afterthought, right? And there's sort of like they tend to have more memory and understanding of a system that they're working in, as opposed to, I start a new session in Claude. It's got it's basically that memory is starting all over again, and it's got to go look at the system. It's got to read code. It's got to sort of orient itself. And if you're giving it something like a very like, hey, pointed command of go do A, B, and C, I mean, largely what I've seen is its design is it's going to go do A, B, and C, regardless of C may be totally wrong, B may be this. And so if you're not if you're providing sort of a very terse description of what you're asking it to do, as opposed to, hey, I want you to do A. If you find problems in A, you need to go back and figure out what those problems are before ever moving on to B. And then when you get to B, if and sort of setting all of that stuff up, I feel like, because it's not really thinking beyond, right? It's not necessarily designed. It's more prediction, right? And it's kind of like, hey, you need to do A, B, C, and D. I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. That's what I'm going to do. It's why a lot in the early days, you would give it something like, hey, I want you to go work on, implement this function over here. And we ended up finding it not only to implement that function over here, but it saw something else and decided to go refactor that as well. And so you end up with sort of like all this collateral, probably, at that time in the early days was damage that would then have to, be resolved by the human going like, well, I asked you to do one thing and you ended up in like 3 different spots and, kind of screwed everything up. And, that's where we had to spend a lot of time, especially, and one of the big reasons we built BrainGrid was to sort of create those guardrails to keep it on track, to keep it focused, to keep it working in the right places, as opposed to kind of wandering all over your code base and making unwanted changes.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and especially as like a, novice engineer myself who's pretty familiar with these tools. It's very easy if you don't have foundational knowledge to ask
Yep.
the wrong thing or use the wrong language or something like that. And I think to your point earlier about the, software engineers not being obsolete just yet.
Yeah.
I think that's really where they start to shine, right? And there's parallels to this, right? I remember like when I was a kid, I'm just old enough to have remembered a little time pre-internet. And so, but I know that there was an era where like if I wanted to be online, I had to learn to code. So I had to be able to do a little HTML if I wanted to put up my stupid little landing page so that I could get it on my little, Palm Pilot or whatever I had back then. And so, BlackBerry Pearl, that's what it was.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I had to learn a little bit of code to get there. And so, but learning that little bit of code was then the differentiation between me and like a pure novice or a pure amateur, right?
Yep.
Then there was this shift that happened where you started to see things like WordPress, and they got more sophisticated over time, but sort of the WYSIWYG style editors, where people who didn't really know anything could now start delving into stuff that used to require team. And so there was sort of that transition where it was like, okay, well now my HTML knowledge is kind of irrelevant. Like I'm not such a developer that my code was strong, but I'm actually stronger now in WordPress or using whatever WYSIWYG type styled editor because I have some foundational background in HTML. And then in my own experience, I took a stint or took like a year as a CMO at a tech startup, software startup. And so I learned a bunch about, APIs and building out schemas and doing all this stuff, actual software development work. And now I've gone to this transition where, again, the world has shifted a little bit. And now amateurs can dally in the land of the experts. We can use these tools to be able to do some of the things that used to require a high level engineer. But because I've got this extra foundational knowledge, I can push that tool further than, your average amateur.
Yeah.
But so to your point about the need of serious software engineers, like you guys, it seems like could push this stuff so much further even still that, you mentioned earlier being able to kind of one shot your approach, and land something that was reasonably good in one shot. I think that is where the line is different. So I think a lot of people are looking at this as like this really giant change. And I mean, AI, don't get me wrong, is a wild technology, but at the same time, it's like almost stage 4 of this web development cycle that's been going on for years, And so even though it is a push, it's made the amateurs better, but it will make the pros even more, more better is probably not the way to say that, but they're going to become even stronger developers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, I don't think it necessarily makes the pros better. It makes them more effective and more efficient. It increases their ability to produce output, right? So at the end of the day, as an engineer, you need to produce output, and the output of that is typically software, well-designed software and code that is performing some level of functionality or feature for the product. If you take a principal level engineer and they dive into the tooling, especially something around like Claude code, and they get really good at sort of orchestrating that, you're going to see their productivity essentially go through the roof. They are going to be able to replicate essentially what's in their head multiple times across multiple agents and orchestrate the outcomes that they expect as if they were doing them themselves. And they're probably also going to be able to cover more because they're going to allow the agents to sort of deal with some of the things that maybe they don't necessarily, a lot of times they're like, I don't want to do this logging or, this sort of stuff over here I'm not super interested in, or the testing. But they're going to be able to cover all of that now because they're going to essentially, manage and orchestrate the swarm of agents to increase their efficiency and output, and literally take what's in their head, their craft, what they've been doing, and sort of translate that into the prompts and the instructions for those agents to more or less like replicate them in a much more meaningful and sort of larger manner. And then if you look at the amateurs, what's happening is all of that knowledge of what we've been doing for decades or the last 10 years, depending on where you're at, however long, we're sort of bringing that knowledge into these harnesses and into these agents. So that way somebody that's never written a line of software in their life can essentially express themselves and their idea in natural language, and an agents or team of agents can take that and actually build that into correctly built software.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, and I think that's a good delineation too. It's sort of, it's pouring gas on the people who are great, but it's not necessarily that they're becoming themselves a better engineer, for example. So, I wanted to just touch on, and we can pivot off of this here in just a second, but I wanted to ask you about what do you think this means then, or like what's the gap between current engineers and those that might be coming through the pipeline now? I always joke about this. I have a co-host here, but he's got some work that conflicts sometimes, so we can't always get together. But he went through this big software accelerator to become a software engineer. Maybe 2 years ago, right? So maybe the worst time to get into junior software engineering.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he did it and he learned a ton. And, to your point, or the point that you just made about, he's a much better AI pilot than your average bear, right? Because he at least has some foundational knowledge.
Yep.
But the job market, I have to imagine, is going to get a little funky for these people as they kind of transition from the old school, the guys that have years of experience in engineering, to sort of whatever this new version is. And I don't know if it's the same where you just come through, you learn your code, you practice, you do your code challenges, et cetera. Or do you actually just train to become like an AI, I always use the word pilot, so do you learn to pilot AI? And then, that's the gig now. Like the software engineer is the super AI pilot that knows that platform and knows that tool inside and out. What do you think the future looks like for those guys?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that's largely where it's going, right? So, I mean, you start to take, the folks at my level that have been doing this for a long time. Obviously, we're going to start to age out, and you know, juniors are going to have to come in and start to replace us as we're retiring or going off to do different things. And those juniors are coming into an entirely different world than what I came into. They're coming into a world where there is a high probability, if not 100% certainty, that that agent is going to be able to write, you know, tremendously better software than they are because of they just don't have the experience and really it's just been trained on so much more. And so, like you said, they're going to have to become sort of the pilots of, what gets fed into those agents and how do they keep those agents, performant and doing what they're supposed to be doing. I think a lot of people talk about the software factory, and you can probably see it all over X and things happening out there. And I don't think it's there yet. And when I sort of describe the factory, it's literally like you have inputs in the form of like requirements and feature requests and different things like that, and the factory spits out fully tested operational code that can then just be deployed right to production. And that's probably an end state that shows up at some point, but it's obviously I don't think there yet. And so you're still requiring, sort of humans on the keyboard in a sense, or at least humans speaking into a microphone, essentially in natural language, describing what it is they need to do, and then augmenting that with context from specifications, requirements, what have you, and getting these things to build it and build it the right way. And so it still needs sort of that shepherding across the line to get it all the way through.
All right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Let's kind of pivot back into more what you're doing at
Mhm.
BrainGrid today and some of the common problems. So, for people who maybe aren't super familiar with this kind of work, there's a number of these platforms out here, and I will probably say some stuff that's wrong about your business, Tyler. So, feel free to correct me. But there's a number of people using these different platforms out there, like Lovable is one, but there's lots of these things
Yep.
where people, I think Replit is another one. People are using these things to build apps. They're using it to build websites. They're using all these things. And basically you can prompt in natural language kind of what you want it to do. So for, our conversation earlier where we were talking about the novice being able to just kind of speak their mind and then have an AI build something out of it, that's a possibility through these platforms. It's not always great. Sometimes it yields bad output,
Yep.
whatever, but it's getting better all the time. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit because I think that where you guys start to step in is in getting past this sort of amateur level where people are toying with this stuff and trying to develop real software using agentic tools or AI tools, whatever your platforms are. And like we've talked about, AI has definitely made building software faster, but what has it not made easier in your view?
I think two things. First and foremost is what to build. Um, I don't think it's made that necessarily easier yet. I think from what I've seen, the humans still have to curate through their own ingenuity and understanding of, their customers, their marketplace of what needs to be built. Um, I think there's still a lot of work there that is largely human driven. So they're providing that input in terms of like, hey, here's what's going to unlock our next level of growth. Here are the things that we feel like our customers need. Here's what we've heard from our customers, and some of that has to be curated and then turned into software that has to be built. And whether that's turning into requirements, but there's some sort of level, there's some input that's coming out of all of that humans are doing that's then being fed into AI to actually go and build. Um, and then I think the next phase is just the ingenuity, right? So the humans are still the ones that have that level of creativity of something new that needs to be built, or something new that doesn't exist, or a novel way of approaching a problem through the lens of software. They're the ones that are coming up with those ideas, and then they're the ones that are having to work with the agents in order to get that built. We're not seeing yet where all of a sudden an agent has launched a brand new software application that it came up with all on its own, that it decided there was a market for it. It decided there was customers and just all of a sudden, automatically built everything. I mean, humans are still the ones that are sort of like the drivers of all of that ingenuity and the new things that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this maybe lends into a little bit, but I mean, I think people spend maybe too much time focusing on the intelligence part of AI and not enough time focusing on the artificial part, which
Yeah.
is to say that it's not really thinking.
Yeah.
You're talking to it like it's a human and you're treating it like it is, but it isn't.
No.
And it's trained on a bunch of knowledge and it sort of, without excessive prompting will sort of give you kind of an average of things or give you kind of a middle of the ground kind of answer on a lot of stuff. And, but I think people think they're talking to something that's truly smart, the same way that you might talk to, I don't know, some super genius, name your guy.
Yeah.
And, like where they're conjuring this out of, just their sheer brain power. But the reality is it's only as good as the input, really,
Yeah.
in the sense that, it's not smart. It's not thinking about things in the same way that humans still think. And maybe we'll get there one day or we'll be able to fake it well enough. But for right now, I don't think we're there. And, but I think that's where BrainGrid really starts to step in, which is around the product planning piece of this. And, so to your point, I mean, yes, the ingenuity and all those things, but I think actually documenting this, not to beat it too hard, but the thing you said too about one-shotting, the way that you're capable of one-shotting a great output from the very beginning is through great planning up front. Like, I mean, you didn't just say, hey, I want an app that does this. Like, that'll get you something. But, if you actually have a full blown set of documentation or whatever, and, maybe you're using AI to help you write the documentation, but, you're definitely creating a product plan or something around this that's making it, or that's drawing the line between sort of amateur software and professional software, I think.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, if you come in and you describe like, hey, I want to build a Kanban style task board to manage my household, and you just drop that in somewhere and you let AI sort of reason about what it is that means. I mean, it's going to come up with something, but is that something necessarily what actually exists in your head, your idea? You gave it a few words, maybe a couple of sentences, and you left a whole bunch of stuff open to interpretation, which is largely going to be interpreted by its training models and everything else. And it's sort of designed to go now build that. Whereas what we try to do is take a step back. So you take those same couple of sentences and words about what it is you describe that's in your head, and we want to tease that out into an entire plan, and we want to actually interact with you to ensure that we're extracting what does this actually mean? Like, what do you want that Kanban board to look like? What do you want to have happen when I drag one from the other? And we want to have that sort of conversational interaction with the user to really ensure that those couple of sentences that they wrote are going to be turned into what they're really thinking about. And I think where that becomes really important is for the non-software folks. So there's plenty of folks out there that have deep domain expertise in areas, but they don't. I mean, they're not engineers. And in the past, somebody with deep expertise would have to go raise some money or have some friends that were engineers. They would have to come together, and the engineers would try to distill everything out of their heads and try to build it. And I think now that's not necessary anymore. Now that person could sit down with BrainGrid and say, okay, here's my idea, and how do I build this? And we're going to look at that idea. Our agents are going to look at that idea. They're going to break it down. They're going to turn that into a project plan. It's going to start with an epic and a bunch of requirements, depending on what it is and the complexity of what you're trying to build. It's going to understand, hey, does this need a database? Hey, what kind of security does this need? What are the components that are going to make up this system? And it's going to think about that. And then it's going to start to present you with questions. It's going to ask you things like, what did you really mean by this statement? And what do you want it to do in this case? And it's going to help you work through those edge cases that you would, in the past would be a product manager and a group of engineers sitting down and working through all that stuff. Now you're able to do that yourself, literally having conversations with our agent inside of BrainGrid. And then as you work through that and you get that requirement specified and built out, you're going to then be able to take it and actually build it with BrainGrid. And BrainGrid is going to go through that, take that requirement, and then start building it on your behalf.
Yeah, there's 2 points that I just kind of want to reaffirm. I think you're totally right. One is, sort of for the non-engineer type, especially, if you're using one of these vibe coding platforms, it's really easy to ask it for something. And like you said, the system will start to do its thing, and it'll start to fill in gaps and make assumptions on your behalf. It'll generate something. And a lot of times that something looks like what you think you wanted. So like
Yep.
to use your example of a Kanban system or something, I'm like, oh, cool. I can drag my cards and blah, blah, blah. But the part that's missing is, I don't know, the database management of these cards as they move from system, spot to spot. And how are we tracking that? And do they persist? And blah, blah, blah. Like there's all these different things that, if you're not engineering focused or if you don't have any experience in that, maybe AI picked up the slack and it knew what you meant, but maybe it didn't. And, without rigorous testing and other things like this, you just don't know. And so I think a lot of times, and I've seen examples of this, I'm sure you have as well, things that people actually ship because they have this level of confidence that, oh, yeah, I did this thing. Look, it's awesome. It works great. But it works only in a singular environment with a singular use case. As soon as you hit refresh, you lose your data, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of that. So I think, to your point, and, having a good plan and building something from the beginning and having a tool like BrainGrid that allows people to sort out those edge cases, because really you don't think about them unless you're thinking sort of engineering minded anyway. So I think that that's really powerful. The other thing I wanted to just kind of add to that, I guess it's sort of related, is just how important the language is. And I will say, sort of as a novice, and ask my wife, she thinks the robots are going to come out to get me as soon as they're fully sentient, because as soon as it starts slipping, I'm like, dude, what are you thinking? Like, come on, like, why would you make such a stupid decision? Like I talk to it like it's bad, a bad friend or something.
Yeah.
And so, at some point, my professionalism slips and I start getting really loose with my language. But I find that that's when I start getting the worst output. If I speak a little more mechanically and I try and use the technical terms. Although I will say my one little hack is I always lead conversations or any big feature addition or feature change I say, I'm not a web developer.
Yeah.
So just understand, so as I'm prompting the system, I'll be like, I'm not a web developer. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm going to try and explain this, but I might use the wrong language, help me through that. And it usually does a pretty charitable job of working with me. But I think, just to back up your point, that I think that that's really where product spec and understanding, first of all, the capability of these tools, but understanding that you just don't want to be leaving it up to assumption to the system. And the parallel that I draw is in the olden days, I guess even as recently as a few years ago, we were still using like development teams out of India and Pakistan and places like this to help us with web projects. And and we still do on bigger builds because I still think it's good to have a human. But the point I wanted to make is that, and you can probably relate to this too if you've done some of the same, is if you don't have your product spec perfect, if you don't have a PRD that uses the right language and explains what you want it to do in the way that's the proper way of saying it, and really articulate your points, if you don't do a good job planning, even with human agents on the other side of the world, as they're working on these things, they will start to make assumptions or they'll guess or they'll do whatever. And then you end up with bad output and you end up with extra cycles and you end up with more billing. And that's where these web projects get the reputation of just, becoming wildly expensive and flying off the rails and getting way out of scope, is that a lot of times they just didn't take the time to plan up front and or said something and left something open to interpretation.
Oh, I mean, 100%. I mean, I've seen that in real time, and we always had that the saying is like, you're throwing it over the wall, right? So like, basically, if you write this, you write this requirement in isolation, and then you throw it over the wall to the development team and expect to get perfection back, or expect to get, what was in your head that you didn't clearly document or you didn't write down, but you wrote something in that spec, you're going to get wildly disappointed. And I think with AI, it's exactly the same. I mean, context is king, and that's why, the first iteration of our product was very focused on bringing, some rigor and structure to this agentic process. And that rigor and structure was in the form of, well-specified requirements, epics, and, breaking that down into tasks, and, really giving it something that had been well thought out, instead of you just going like, hey, here's this one line and I expect magic. Because as soon as you expect magic from that thing, you're going to be wildly disappointed and you're not going to get it. I think some of that has been reduced with the newer models. They've gotten a hell of a lot better, and the harnesses and Claude code and things like that. They've done better training, and they've thought through some of those things, probably because they kept seeing people get wildly disappointed when they were giving him one-line, requirements. But, we saw that very early on because, we were still trying to keep our business running and ship product. And we kept getting things that were like, man, this is garbage. We can't use this. How do we get this? We know it can do it. So what do we have to do? And, it's became very important to get that thing specified and get it broken down. But what's hard is when you've got users now, and our user base, I think for a large part are definitely non-technical folks. How do you get them to have that conversation? And so, we have to sort of ask the questions like, hey, is this, again, like, is this what you're really thinking? And here's the recommendation, the agent would say you should take, but here's some other ones. And if, or do you want to do something completely different? And so it's, again, it's trying to take those non-technical folks and sort of like handhold them through the path of building software.
Well, and I think that, not to blow too much smoke up your butt, but I think this is a really good place for a business like this, because it's clear that people will try and do more themselves than maybe they would have in the past as it pertains to web development because of tools like this. And so having tools like yours or having organizations like yours that will kind of shepherd people through this, that will help them get the training or understand the questions or even just know the questions to ask, right? Because for most people, it's like, maybe to your point earlier, you were talking about people having a clear vision of what they want, but they just don't know how to say it. Yeah. And so, so in those situations, I think a lot of times just because of their lack of engineering training, they're asking the wrong questions or not providing the right data. And, just by doing that planning in advance, you can greatly increase your output. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about just sort of, and we've talked about it a little bit throughout the show, but I kind of hate the term, but the vibe coding thing. I wanted to talk to you about, these would be the platforms like Lovable and Replit and these other things that I mentioned earlier. But like, what do you think that the vibe coding is getting right? So for people who are trying to use it or maybe striking out on their own and they want to give it a shot, they don't realize they have a problem that they need BrainGrid for yet. They will, but they haven't got there yet. And so, but what do you think vibe coding or the platforms, and we can just stick to the major players or whoever you have the most experience with, are getting right? And then where do you see that stuff start to break down?
I mean, largely what we've seen is what they're getting right is that, that idea to the aha moment. And so again, if you're, non-technical, non-developer, you've got this idea, you can go into these platforms and, to the best of your ability, articulate that idea. And, you're going to see something and you're going to be like, holy crap, like that is actually on the web. Like that appears to you as being real. And so it kind of like, you get that dopamine hit of like, I took an idea, now I've got software. But, is it really, and what level is that software actually at? Is it something that like, hey, I had an idea and all of a sudden magically I've got a, highly scalable production level system that I can ship and serve 1 million people? No, it's not going to happen. Like that's a pipe dream right now. But again, what they're getting right is, they're taking people that, largely have had ideas and could never do anything in software because again, they weren't developers, and sort of, I would say, giving them hope in terms of like, hey, I can take this and maybe I can do something with it. And I can get it to a certain stage of maybe now I need to go get a technical co-founder. And the reason I say that is we had a lot of early customers coming to us that were like, hey, I've built this thing on Lovable and it's getting to a level of sophistication that anytime I ask it to do this, it breaks the rest of the system and I just can't get beyond this. And then, I went over to you guys and I basically told it the same thing. You built a requirement, you gave me a plan, and I let, execute it with Claude, and holy shit, it just works now. And, that was kind of like our aha moment is like, look, if you do the planning and you get the context right, these agents are going to build what you need and they're going to do it the right way. And so, largely where we would see people leaving those platforms is, they were like, oh my God, I just spent, weeks putting this thing together and it's just not quite right, or it keeps breaking, or it, completely just, I'll ask it to do one thing and it destroys everything. I'm so frustrated, like save us basically. And, and that's how we end up getting a lot of our customers coming that way.
Yeah, well, and I'll say it's interesting too, because with a lot of these platforms, they're sort of token based, or you get so many tries at something.
Yeah.
And so in having similar experiences myself in Lovable, like if I didn't have a high enough token limit, for example, you could spend a lot of your time, your tokens, your bandwidth, whatever the metric there, your supplier is using. You could spend a big chunk of that just fixing the problem that you just made through one bad prompt.
Yeah.
And then you've burned your month's usage, or whatever. So now your project is kicked another month down the road.
Yeah.
And so efficiency in that sense is really important. I mean, unless you have some kind of, I don't know, multi-gajillion dollar grandmaster, level version of whatever platform. But like, I mean, I use Claude Max, and I'm constantly hitting usage limits and stuff like that. And that's the big plan,
Yeah.
right? I mean, well, the bigger plan, the bigger consumer level plan. And so anyway, so I think that, to your point, like getting it right or having efficiency around those things is great, because if you're constantly going back and fixing what you did, you end up burning a lot of that stuff. So that illusion of completion idea is
yeah, you
good.
burn a lot of it, and you're frustrated, and you're like, now what do I do? Like, I'm kind of screwed. I've got to go find something else because, I'm out of credits. And now I've got to like, oh shit, I've got to pull that code down. Do I have to go sign up for a Claude Max? Do I have to get a Claude Pro? Do I need to go to Codex? Now I've got to try to set up a development environment. And, as we sort of evolved our platform, we kept seeing people, writing in the messages, like they built this plan out. It was a beautiful plan. They're like, okay, now implement it. And our agent's like, sorry, I can't do that. I'm a planning agent. I don't do that. You need to use Claude or Cursor or whatever else it was. And we found that to be a drop-off point. Because, think of the non-tech folks trying to set up a local development environment, on Windows or, their MacBook. Like, you got to get in the terminal, what's a terminal?
Yeah.
And it's like, they don't necessarily want to spend the time or the investment to kind of walk through getting all of that stuff set up. And it's a pretty big leap for, a number of folks to be able to operate at that level. Maybe for you and I, that's like, okay, whatever, second nature. We've done it a million times, but the person from logistics that, has this amazing idea, they're probably not going to want to do that sort of stuff. And then they're going to hop into a Lovable, and they're going to get something to a certain point. And then when it gets to a level of complexity, they may get frustrated, and now where do they go?
Yeah. So I wonder if we could just take a second and just talk about maybe the difference between prototype and product, because I wonder if this isn't maybe a line where we could draw, something definitive in the sand and say, hey, basically, this is kind of where you're kind of good to operate on your own, which is maybe you're building sort of a rough draft, or you're just trying to get a concept out, or maybe get a proof of theory or something. And then there's like this other thing that's the production level, ready to go. And I wonder if you just talk about sort of the difference between making a prototype versus making something real. And, I put real in quotes because, I mean, I guess if you can see it, it's real. But, like you made the point earlier, could you actually run this with 1 million users? And the answer is no. So what's the difference between sort of a prototype versus a real product?
Yeah, I mean, the prototype to me allows you to, prove a part of a hypothesis. And, a lot of times being able to see and interact with that prototype is going to allow you to form a more educated opinion about, hey, is this the right layout? Is this the right sort of workflow that we want? And obviously with AI now, you can do that very cheaply and quickly. And I think, most product managers today should be doing this, probably at the same time they're either writing that spec or working on that spec, or they're taking that spec and saying, all right, let's turn this into a prototype, and like, walking through the workflow, walking through the buttons. Is that in the right place? Do I like this? Does this make a lot of sense? Before sort of giving it off to maybe it's the engineering team, or taking it to the next level. The prototype should allow you to answer the questions that you have of the feature that you want to build, and allow you to sort of visualize what it is, possibly, or at least prove your hypothesis that this makes sense. The production level is, can I take that and operate that in a repeatable, reliable manner where I can observe it, where I can scale it, where I can understand it, where it's going to stand up to continual usage. It's going to stand up to people doing things to it that I didn't necessarily anticipate, and not blow up in extraordinary ways. Or at least when it does blow up, it blows up in a way that, the user's not left in a completely crashed out mode or something else like that. It's taking it from something that's helping you, answer questions, prove an idea, to something that can be used in a more general purpose and is scalable, whether it has to scale to, 10, 50 to a million. That's going to be the next level of it. And there's a whole lot more engineering aside from just like, hey, I built it, to scaling it, to operating it, to observing it, being able to ensure that, you're reacting to errors properly and people are having the right type of experience with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, and to, just kind of use again, it's a personal example, but like with the recent website I built for our company, I had built it using Figma Make as a way to generate the UI basically for it. And what it does is it builds sort of a React JavaScript kind of platform that, it looks great. It's really clickable. It loads really fast. It does all this stuff. Well, it wasn't until much later that I realized, as a non-engineer, non-developer myself, that those kinds of websites are like not crawlable. Basically, they just, it's 5 lines of text. It's, when you look at the source for those things or whatever. So all the data I was putting on there that I was hoping I could rank in Google or whatever for, none of that stuff was visible. So after a long heart to heart with Claude, we had a conversation. We put together an idea for how I could take this website that I really like, but how can I make it so that it works a little better? And we ended up moving to a platform or a back-end infrastructure called Astro, and basically rebuilt the website or refactored it on top of this new platform so that it would render full HTML pages and all of our pages could then be crawlable. And so, but those I think are the kinds of things that are the big delineator, one of the big boundaries between sort of the amateur and the professional, which is it didn't even occur to me until I discovered the problem. And then luckily I had enough wherewithal to be able to fix the problem. But if I had just shipped that or had gone to market with it or something like that, like I'd be like, oh God, how come nobody can find my website? Like, why am I
Yeah.
not coming up on Google? What's going on?
Yeah.
And so it would end up being a bigger problem. And if I didn't have the language or the right questions to ask, I wouldn't even know how to solve it, or where to go.
No, you'd basically be stuck like everyone else. It's push something out there that, hey, I've got a domain and I've got something behind it, but no one can discover it. Nobody knows about it. Nobody, unless I somehow got very lucky, because, I never published my sitemap. Oh, my SEO, I open up, I don't even know what Lighthouse is. All of these other things that come with sort of that level of professional software development, you're just not, going to know about them. And, that's another thing that when we think about our platform, because again, we're sort of targeted, it's sort of like those consumers that are not necessarily technical. Those are all things that we have to think about. Like we have to think about for you on your behalf, because we can't have the expectation that you're going to even know about these things. So how do we allow our builders, our agents to sort of like jam all of that stuff in there so it's there and available and is actually just behind the scenes already there and working?
Yeah. Yep. Nope. I think that's right. So in these last few minutes, I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the BrainGrid structure. And if I have this wrong, feel free to correct me.
Okay.
But as I understand, you guys use sort of this build, verify, trust kind of framework where you start with capturing, structuring, building, and then verifying. And, obviously we've been talking about the reasons why verification and these things are such a big deal. But I wonder if you'd sort of just take us through the process of running a project with you guys. What does that mean to capture it, develop the structure, to build, what does this look like in terms of an engagement with BrainGrid?
Yeah. So, I mean, it all starts with the idea. So everything, we do starts with an idea. So you provide that idea to us in natural language. We will then, our agents will then, I keep saying we, but it's our agents, will essentially, look at that idea. And the first thing that it'll do is we find most people that come to us don't even have like a GitHub repo, right? And so you don't need any of that stuff. We'll take care of that for you. So we will create a BrainGrid managed repo for you. And then the first question we look at is based upon that idea that they've given us, does this need data persistence? Does it need a database? If it does, we'll provision one for you. So we'll then provision a BrainGrid managed database for you. Then we'll go into actually turning that idea into sort of that first specification. And again, our agents are going to look at it and say like, hey, can I do this in just a single requirement? If it's sufficiently easy enough that the agent feels it can do it in a single requirement, it's going to write that single requirement and send you straight into the build process. And then the builder is going to take it over and start doing all the implementation. If it's not, it's going to look at it and say, okay, let's actually break this down more because I don't quite have enough information. It's probably got questions. Let's turn this into an epic and then a certain number, in requirements after that in order to satisfy that epic and what it is that you're trying to build. And so you've come in, and let's just say you take the more complex path. The first thing you're going to get is a project brief, and that project brief is going to be our interpretation or the agent's interpretation from your idea of what it is you're trying to build. And that's going to be your first opportunity to start that engagement with the agent. And it's going to ask you, hey, here's what I think you're trying to do. Does this make sense? Or am I missing something? And so you can then go back to it and say like, it's close, but I wish it would do this, this, and this. And then we'll refine it. And then it's going to break that down into the requirements. And so let's imagine whatever you're trying to build, you get 5 requirements out of it. And so then it's going to sort of put that skeleton together. And then what you have to do is now specify each one of those requirements. So you go into the first requirement and you'll click a button that says specify. That agent will then start to go through everything and say, okay, I see you want to build this. I can see the epic and the project plan. I have a few questions. Let me go through those questions. Great. You've answered them all. Here's requirement 1. And now you could actually just go straight into building it. And so essentially the pattern is, you've got this project plan, you specify those requirements, you build the requirement, and then you could publish that requirement. Then you go back, specify the next requirement. So it's essentially synchronous of, not necessarily parallel, but, one step at a time of taking you through that development process, requirement by requirement, until you've got the entire thing built. The builder is going to take care of like all the testing and everything else like that. It's going to build all of that framework into, the application that it's building. And then you're going to be able to deploy it, and you're going to get a URL that's essentially like, okay, there's that thing that I just, spent my time on that was in my head, an hour or so ago. And now I've actually got a URL out there of some sort of working software.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, and I love that it's just, I don't know, that structured framework I think really helps people, especially non-technical founders, to figure things out. When you are doing this verification step though, and you're trying to work against AI built software, are you verifying against the original spec? Are you verifying against needs? Like how are you, or user needs or business goals? Like what does your verification process look like?
Yeah. So each requirement that we generate not only has functional requirements, technical requirements. At the end, it's got a big set of acceptance criteria. And that acceptance criteria is going to be dependent upon what it is that's being built in that requirement. And then that acceptance criteria is then used by the builder. So when that builder pulls that requirement down and starts to implement it, it's then going to obviously go through all the implementation. It's going to make sure that TypeScript validation passes, linting passes, tests are passing, all of that good stuff. And then when it feels like, okay, my implementation is done, it's going to go pull all of that acceptance criteria, go back and look at the code, and then ensure that it meets the acceptance criteria either through testing or code, and provide evidence back that, hey, this acceptance criteria is met by this here. And it's going to do that through every single one of those. And if it finds something that it's not meeting the acceptance criteria, it's going to loop again and come back and keep working through it until it gets it right.
Okay. And then on the other side of that equation, and maybe you guys help with this, I just wanted to get clarity around it. Like what should the founders or the people who come to you with a project, what should they be doing on their end in terms of auditing that first draft of AI developed software? I mean, if they don't know everything, but like what should they be looking at? User flows, data models, security, like what are the things that you would prioritize with them, and how much of the onus is on them to do that vetting versus, you guys providing that?
Well, I mean, the vetting of the output today is going to largely be on them, right? So I would say first and foremost, they want to pay attention to the input. So as they've come with that idea and that requirement has been generated or requirements have been generated, they want to read through them. They want to make sure that it's capturing what their ideas are and what it is they're trying to build. And if it's not, or they want to change it, is have that conversation with the agent in order to get it to what it is that they want. And then after the post build and they've shipped something, or they're interacting in the preview window, it's going to be up to them to sort of go through that and ensure that the agent didn't necessarily miss something, which, obviously, as we know, they could, or maybe it misinterpreted something. But, it's kind of up to them to go through and then play that user role and click through and actually use the software and make sure it's doing what they want. And if it's not, provide the feedback to the agent so it can go and fix it and get it the way they want. Or maybe they've gone through and it's doing exactly what they want, but now they want to change it. And they're sort of like, this doesn't quite, no, I thought it was this way, but I don't really like it like this. I want to move the button over here. I want this drop down here. Well, they got to take that information, and give it back to the agent just as you would a human and say like, all right, let's change this. Here's what I want done. And then they sit back and watch it, and it's going to go through everything and make the change.
Awesome. Okay, well, cool. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe I went too far too fast saying that we shouldn't be treating AI like humans. I mean, they're maybe just people just like us.
Well, I mean, I think, it's they're humans that never sleep, right? So like they're available. I mean, they're and they never get tired. They never complain. You don't have to give them a performance report. You're not paying them necessarily a salary. So, but still at the same time, like, I try to treat mine as like, kind of not necessarily, maybe almost like a peer, right? It's like, all right, we've got to solve this problem. We're going to solve it together. I'm not going to write the software for it, but I am going to validate what it is that you've done. And here's a way that we want to do it. I want you to do some of the validation. I want you to create some of the testing framework, but we need to solve this problem ultimately so my customer, doesn't run into this issue or gets this new feature.
Yeah, no, I love that. Tyler, we're coming up on the end of the hour.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a minute and just let people know where they can track you down online, if they want to learn more about BrainGrid, where they can go, and if they wanted to try and connect with you individually, how that might happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to find us, BrainGrid.ai. We're also LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram as well. So hopefully people are seeing some of the videos our marketing people are putting out there. Saw a really cool one the other day they threw out there. They basically built like a Nike clone site that was like, it was amazing. It looked beautiful. And then, yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter at Tyler Wells and LinkedIn, Tyler S. Wells. And yeah, easy to find me.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Tyler. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today. It's been awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week. And we'll see you guys next time.